My manager laughed when I handed in my resignation letter. Not a polite, awkward laugh, a full, head-thrown-back laugh, like I had just told the funniest joke she'd heard all year. Her assistant standing by the door joined in a second later, the way people do when they want to make sure the person in charge notices them laughing. I didn't say anything. I just looked at my manager steadily, picked up my bag, and walked back to my desk. That was on a Friday. By the following Thursday, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. When I finally answered, the voice on the other end wasn't anyone I expected. It was the regional director of operations for our entire division, a man I had never spoken to directly in my 11 years at the company. His first words weren't hello, they were, "Can you tell me exactly what your role was there, because I'm looking at what's happened in the past 5 days and nobody here can explain it." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. My name is Renata. I'm 29 years old, and for the past 4 years, I had been working as a supply chain coordination specialist at a mid-sized distribution company headquartered in Mississauga, Ontario. Before that, I spent 2 years as a junior analyst at the same company straight out of university, so in total I had been there since I was 23. Not a lifetime, not 37 years, but in the world of vendor relationships and logistics coordination, 4 years in one role, handling the same accounts with the same people on the other end of the line, is enough time to build something that doesn't show up anywhere on a spreadsheet. I want to explain how things actually worked before I explain how they fell apart, because the two are connected in a way that my manager, her name was Diane, never bothered to understand. Our company distributed commercial kitchen equipment across Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. We weren't the biggest player in the space, but we had a reputation for reliability that had taken years to build. A big part of that reliability lived in the vendor relationships. We had 5 key suppliers, 3 in Ontario, 1 in Quebec, 1 in BC, and the terms we had negotiated with them over the years were genuinely exceptional. Early shipment priority during peak season, flexible payment windows during cash flow crunches, replacement guarantees that other distributors in our space could only dream about. Those terms didn't exist because our company had the best contracts. They existed because the people on the vendor side knew that when they called our coordination line, they'd reach someone who knew their systems, remembered their constraints, and never made them repeat themselves. That someone was me. I had inherited 2 of those accounts from a colleague who retired, and I had built the other 3 myself. Our main Quebec supplier, I had spent 6 months earning the trust of their logistics manager, a woman named Francine, before she ever agreed to our preferred scheduling arrangement. Our BC supplier had initially wanted to drop us entirely after a billing dispute that predated my time in the role. I had flown out there on my own initiative, not on the company's dime, because the travel budget request was denied, and spent 2 days at their facility, understanding their operation before I proposed a revised term structure that worked for both sides. They stayed. The relationship had been solid for 3 years since. None of this was invisible. Exactly. My performance reviews were good. My numbers were strong. But Diane had joined the company 14 months before I resigned, brought in from a consulting background to modernize the supply chain function, and from the moment she arrived, she had a particular way of looking at what I did that I can only describe as not quite seeing it. Diane was 36, sharp in the way that people who have always been evaluated on presentations and frameworks tend to be sharp. She could build a process map in 20 minutes and make it look beautiful. What she struggled with, and I say this without pleasure, because it caused me a lot of stress, was the difference between a process and a relationship. To Diane, the vendor terms we had were terms in a contract. The fact that those terms were maintained by ongoing human trust was not something her frameworks had a column for. Her assistant, a woman named Priya who had joined the company the same month Diane had and who seemed to operate as Diane's shadow and amplifier in equal measure, was even less interested in operational nuance. Priya's talent was for optics. She knew how to make things look good in a report, how to frame numbers, how to make sure that whatever Diane needed to present upward landed well. Together, they were a formidable pair, as long as the thing they were managing was a presentation rather than an actual supply chain. The friction between Diane and me had started within her first 3 months. It was never dramatic. It was the quiet, grinding kind, the kind that wears you down, not through confrontation, but through accumulated, small moments. Diane would hold team meetings where she'd outline a new standardized process for vendor communication, and I would raise concerns about how it would land with specific contacts, and she would nod the way people nod when they have no intention of incorporating what you've said. Priya would follow up afterward with a summary email that reframed my concerns as resistance to change. After a while, I started keeping copies of those emails. The specific incident that pushed things to a breaking point happened about 3 months before I resigned. Diane had decided to centralize vendor communication. What this meant in practice was that all outgoing contact with our suppliers would now be routed through a shared team inbox, managed on a rotating basis, rather than through established individual contacts. The rationale was accountability and documentation. The reality was that it stripped out the personal layer that made our vendor relationships actually function. I explained this to Diane directly. I told her that Francine at our Quebec supplier had explicitly said in the past that she worked with us because she trusted that her calls would reach someone who understood her constraints, not a rotating inbox. I told her that our BC contact had a strong preference for direct communication and that any shift to a generic system would read to him as deprioritization. Diane listened, made a note, and said she appreciated the context. Then she rolled out the centralized inbox system, 2 weeks later, without any of the accommodations I had suggested. Over the following 6 weeks, response times with 2 of our 5 key vendors slowed noticeably. One vendor flagged a miscommunication about a shipment window that cost us a 2-week delay on a large order. Diane's team documented the delay as a vendor-side scheduling issue. I have the original email chain that shows it was a response to a message sent from the shared inbox that contained incorrect information about our order volume information that I had flagged as incorrect before it was sent, in writing, and that had been sent anyway. I kept working. I kept managing my accounts as best I could within the new system, spending extra hours compensating for the structural gaps the centralized inbox had created. Because the vendors were my relationships, and I wasn't willing to let them deteriorate over a process I hadn't designed. But it was exhausting in a way that's hard to articulate, the experience of watching something you've built get slowly dismantled by someone who doesn't know what they're dismantling. The final month was the hardest. Diane had begun what I can only describe as a quiet campaign to document me as a performance problem. The overtime I was logging to compensate for the inbox gaps was suddenly characterized, in a one-on-one meeting, as inefficiency. The extra time I was spending on vendor calls to smooth over miscommunications that the shared inbox had created was described as failure to adapt to the new workflow. Priya started CCing herself onto emails I sent to flag discrepancies, then forwarding versions of those exchanges to Diane, with framing that made me look like I was creating problems rather than identifying them. I want to be honest. I considered fighting it more directly. I thought about going to HR. I thought about going over Diane's head. But I had been in workplaces long enough to know how those conversations tend to go when it's a new manager with a consulting pedigree and an excellent relationship with senior leadership versus a mid-level specialist who can't point to a single document that proves what she's describing. Everything I was experiencing was deniable. The pattern was clear to me, but patterns aren't the same as evidence, and I was tired. So I made a different decision. I started talking quietly to my vendor contacts, not about what was happening internally, just checking in, making sure they had my personal contact information, letting them know I was thinking about what was next for me professionally. I didn't ask them to do anything. I didn't say anything negative about the company. I just made sure the connections I had spent years building were ones that would survive my departure. Then I gave my 4 weeks' notice. Diane's laugh, when I handed her the letter, was the first genuinely authentic emotional response I had seen from her in 14 months. Priya's echo of it from the doorway told me everything I needed to know about what had been said about me in that office when I wasn't in the room. I spent those 4 weeks doing the most thorough offboarding documentation I have ever produced. Every account, every vendor contact, every arrangement, every nuance. I wrote it all down. I scheduled handover calls for every active relationship. I prepared briefing notes for whoever would be taking over each account. I did everything right because I believe in doing things right, even when the people around you don't, and because I knew not out of vindictiveness, but out of simple professional realism that whoever tried to step into those relationships without that documentation would struggle. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly it would all unravel. I left on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, 5 business days after my last day, I started receiving personal messages from some of my former vendor contacts. Not asking me to do anything, just letting me know what was happening. Francine from Quebec called me on my personal cell, which she had because we'd worked together for 4 years, and said quietly that she had received 2 messages through the shared inbox that week that had incorrect pricing references, and that she was reaching out to let me know she had escalated internally at her end. Our BC contact sent me an email, carefully worded, asking if I knew who the new primary contact on our account would be, because he had been trying to get clarification on a spring allocation question for 3 days. A third vendor, a smaller Ontario supplier we used for specialty items, sent a message saying that, given the current uncertainty on our account, they were placing our priority scheduling on hold, pending a review. I didn't intervene. It wasn't my place anymore. I had a new position starting in 3 weeks at a logistics firm in Brampton, a role I was genuinely excited about, and I had done my offboarding properly. What happened next was not something I caused. What happened was that all 3 of those vendors, along with 2 others, independently contacted either our company's general line or individuals they knew at the regional level to communicate some version of "we need clarity" before we proceed. In 2 cases, the word hold was used in relation to upcoming orders. The total value of orders in play across those communications was, as I would later learn, somewhere in the range of $2.3 million. I know the number because the regional director of operations told me when he called. His name was Gordon, and when I answered his call that Thursday evening, I was making dinner and half expecting it to be someone trying to sell me an extended warranty. I was not expecting the regional director of a company I had just left to be on the other end of the line, speaking in the careful, controlled tone of a person who is managing a situation they do not yet fully understand. "Miss Osei," he said, "I want to be straightforward with you. We've had some significant disruptions to our vendor relationships over the past week, and as I've been looking into the situation, your name keeps coming up. I'm hoping you can help me understand what your role there actually involved, because I'm not getting a clear picture from the documentation I have." I set down my wooden spoon. I took a breath, and I said, "I'm happy to talk. Can I ask what documentation you've been looking at?" What followed was a long conversation, longer than I expected, and more candid than I think Gordon had intended it to be. He had been brought in from the parent company to assess the situation after the regional VP had flagged the vendor disruptions as a potential risk to the quarterly numbers. He had gone to Diane's team first, naturally, and had received a version of events that I will describe charitably as incomplete. The version he'd received suggested that the vendor disruptions were a temporary adjustment period following a staffing transition, that the new workflow systems were sound, and that one former employee had been resistant to process changes during her final months. I told Gordon my version, calmly, specifically, with dates and details and references to documents I still had copies of because I had kept copies of everything, not out of paranoia, but because I am organized, and because the emails were sent to my work account, which I had access to through the transition period. I told him about the centralized inbox rollout and the concerns I had raised in writing before it launched. I told him about the vendor escalations I had flagged internally and how they had been characterized in documentation. I told him about Francine, about the BC relationship, about the Ontario supplier who had now placed our priority scheduling on hold. Gordon listened. He asked good questions. He was clearly someone who understood operations, not just strategy, and I could hear in his voice when things were landing. At the end of the conversation, he asked if I would be willing to join a call the following week with him and the regional VP. I said I would think about it. He asked if there was anything I needed. I said no. Then, before I hung up, I said. Gordon, I want to be clear, I didn't do anything to cause this. I built those relationships over 4 years and I left them as intact as I possibly could. What you're seeing is what happens when the people who replace you don't know what they were actually replacing. There was a pause. And then he said, I'm starting to understand that. The call with the regional VP happened the following Tuesday. I joined from the spare bedroom of my apartment in Oakville, on my personal laptop, dressed professionally from the waist up. Gordon was on the call. Diane was also on the call, which I had not been told in advance. Priya was not. The first few minutes were awkward, in the specific way that meetings are awkward, when everyone in the room is aware that the narrative has already shifted, but not everyone is ready to acknowledge it yet. Diane looked, on camera, like she had slept badly. I recognized the look. I had worn it myself for the better part of the past year. The regional VP, a woman named Carol, who I had seen exactly once at a company all-hands meeting 3 years prior, started by thanking me for my time and acknowledging that the past 2 weeks had surfaced some important questions about how the vendor relationships functioned. She asked me to walk through my understanding of the key accounts. I did. I was concise, factual, and specific. I didn't say anything negative about Diane directly. I didn't need to. The facts were doing that work without any help from me. At one point, Diane tried to reframe the situation as a documentation gap, suggesting that the real problem was that I hadn't transferred my knowledge adequately during offboarding. I had expected something like this. I said, without any particular heat in my voice, that I had produced 47 pages of offboarding documentation over my final 4 weeks, that I had scheduled and conducted 8 vendor handover calls, and that I had sent 3 follow-up emails to my direct manager, asking for confirmation that the materials had been reviewed. I then said I was happy to share those documents with anyone on the call who wanted them. Diane's face on the camera did something complicated. Carol said she would appreciate receiving them. What happened after that call is something I know partly from Gordon, who kept me loosely informed over the following weeks, and partly from a former colleague who had stayed at the company and who messaged me occasionally. The internal review that Carol initiated found significant gaps in how the vendor relationships had been managed during the transition. The centralized inbox system was rolled back within 2 weeks. 2 of the 5 key vendors were brought back to active priority status through direct outreach from Gordon himself, outreach that, I was told, required significant concession on the company's part to rebuild goodwill. The third vendor, the Ontario specialty supplier, took longer. The BC relationship, the one I had flown out to save 3 years earlier, required Carol to place a personal call to their president. Diane resigned approximately 6 weeks after that call. I don't know the specifics of how that came about, and I won't speculate. What I do know is that her departure was announced internally as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities, which is the corporate language for a situation that has been managed quietly. Priya transferred to a different department. Gordon called me one more time, about a month after the Tuesday call. He said the company was restructuring the supply chain coordination function and asked whether I would have any interest in consulting on the vendor recovery effort on a contract basis. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him I had started my new position and was genuinely happy there. And then I said the thing I had been thinking about since that first Thursday evening phone call, the thing I had held back until the moment was right. I said, I'd be open to a consulting arrangement. But I want to be transparent. My day rate is $180 an hour, and I'd need a minimum 6-week engagement to make it worth structuring properly. If that works for your budget, I'm glad to have that conversation. There was a brief silence. Then Gordon said, let me bring that to Carol. Carol approved it. I spent 6 weeks consulting for the company I had resigned from, at a day rate that was roughly equivalent to what I had been earning annually on a prorated basis, while simultaneously building momentum in my new permanent role. By the time the consulting engagement ended, 2 of the 3 disrupted vendor relationships were fully restored. The third had been transitioned to a new coordinator who I had spent 2 weeks properly briefing in the way that my offboarding should have been received the first time. I don't tell this story because I want anyone to feel sorry for me, or because I think what happened to me was uniquely terrible. It wasn't. People get managed out of roles they've built and loved every day, by people who don't understand what they're replacing. And most of the time, there's no dramatic resolution. Most of the time, the vendors quietly find another supplier and nobody calls the person who left. I tell it because of what I learned, and because I think it's worth saying plainly. The value you create at work is real, even when the people around you can't see it. It doesn't disappear when you do. Sometimes, in fact, it becomes most visible in the exact moment of your absence, not because you made it disappear, but because it was always there, held together by your presence, and the people who dismissed it never understood what they were holding until they had to carry it themselves. Document everything. Not because you're planning for a confrontation, but because clarity protects everyone, including you. When your record is clean and your documentation is thorough, there is very little that a misleading narrative can do to you. Facts have a way of surfacing when the stakes are high enough. Know what your relationships are worth not just to you, but to the people who depend on them. This is not about leverage. It's about understanding the actual value of the work you do, the real work, not the work that appears in a process map or a performance metric. The human layer of professional life is not soft. It is load-bearing. And when it's removed carelessly, things fall. Lastly, choose yourself. I chose to leave rather than to keep grinding in an environment that was making me smaller. That decision was hard. It felt, at the time, like I was the one losing. But I left with my integrity, my relationships, and a very clear record, and when the situation resolved the way it did, I was in a position to respond from a place of strength rather than desperation. There is a version of this story where I stayed, became increasingly demoralized, and eventually left in a worse position with a worse outcome. I'm grateful every day that I didn't live that version. My new role is good. The team is thoughtful. My manager asks questions before making decisions, and she has this habit, in one-on-ones, of saying, "What am I missing?" 4 words that I had not heard in 14 months, and that I now understand, were exactly what was missing all along. I still get a message from Francine occasionally. Just check-ins, logistics updates, the occasional note about shipping windows. Professional, warm, efficient. Some relationships outlast the structures that were built around them. That, I think, is a form of evidence too.